The Petro-Dollar Trap, how oil became America's secret weapon. In 1973, the world ran out of cheap oil and almost out of money. Gas lines stretched for miles, prices doubled overnight, and Western economies began to suffocate. But while nations panicked, one quiet meeting in the desert rewired the global economy forever. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't a peace deal. It was something far more powerful, an agreement that bound oil to the U.S. dollar. From that moment on, every barrel of oil sold anywhere on earth would be priced and paid for in dollars. In return, America offered protection, weapons, and influence to the oil-rich kingdoms of the Middle East. The world didn't realize it yet, but that single handshake created an empire, not of land, but of currency. The petrodollar, a system so profitable, so invisible, that it turned America's money into the most powerful weapon in human history. And half a century later, that same weapon may now be turning against its creators. How the petrodollar was born. To understand the petrodollar, we have to go back to the moment when America's money lost its anchor. For decades, the U.S. dollar was backed by gold, each note a promise you could trade for real metal. But in 1971, drowning in Vietnam, war costs, and foreign debt, President Richard Nixon did the unthinkable. He ended the dollar's link to gold, closing the gold window and breaking the last tie between money and something real. Overnight, the dollar became just paper and faith. The world panicked. Nations wondered, why hold a currency that could lose value by the day? Oil producers, especially Saudi Arabia, the world's new energy superpower, were watching closely. 2 years later, the 1973 oil crisis hit. The Arab states, furious over Western support for Israel, cut oil supplies. Prices quadrupled. The global economy froze, but behind closed doors, Washington was already crafting a deal that would change everything. In 1974, U.S. officials met Saudi leaders with a simple proposal: price all your oil in U.S. dollars, and in return, America will protect your kingdom. The Saudis agreed. Every oil-producing nation soon followed. The world's most vital resource, oil, was now tied to one currency. And because every country needed oil, every country now needed U.S. dollars. That single agreement turned the dollar into the bloodstream of the global economy, forcing nations to earn, borrow, or trade in dollars just to survive. The United States had discovered a new kind of power, not through gold, not through conquest, but through demand. How the petrodollar became America's secret weapon. Once oil and dollars became inseparable, America discovered something extraordinary. Every nation that needed oil now needed dollars first. That meant they had to trade with America, borrow from American banks, or buy American debt just to keep their energy flowing. In effect, the world began paying tribute to the U.S. economy, and America found a way to turn that dependence into power. When a country bought oil, it paid in dollars. The oil exporters, in turn, invested those dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds, stocks, and banks. This endless loop created what economists called petrodollar recycling. The result? The U.S. could print money and the world would absorb it. Inflation that would destroy smaller economies barely dented America because its currency was everyone's problem. The petrodollar became more than a system. It became a weapon of global control. With it, the U.S. could pressure nations without sending armies. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and financial isolation became the new form of warfare. If a country resisted American policy, its access to dollars could be cut off overnight. Iraq tried in 2000, selling oil in euros. 3 years later, it was invaded. Libya proposed a gold-backed African currency. By 2011, its government was gone. Coincidence or consequence? The message was clear. The global energy market wasn't just about oil anymore. It was about control. And every drop of that power flowed through the dollar. The cost of keeping it alive. The petrodollar gave America more power than any empire in history. But power always demands a price. To keep the dollar at the center of global trade, America had to protect the oil and the nations that supplied it. That meant alliances with dictators, endless military bases across the Middle East, and wars that cost trillions of dollars and countless lives. In the 1980s and 1990s, the system worked flawlessly. The U.S. printed, borrowed, and spent freely, confident that the world would keep demanding its currency. But by the 2000s, cracks began to appear. As new powers like China rose, global oil demand began shifting east. Yet every transaction still had to pass through the dollar pipeline, giving Washington enormous leverage, but also enormous responsibility. America had to keep the flow of oil stable at any cost. The Gulf Wars, the sanctions, the endless military patrols, they weren't just about oil. They were about preserving the monopoly that kept the dollar alive. By the 2010s, the cost of maintaining that dominance became staggering. Over $8 trillion spent on wars, interest rates kept artificially low to finance debt, and rising inequality at home. The petrodollar had turned into a paradox. The very system that made America rich was now making it vulnerable. And as the world began exploring new energy sources and new alliances, the dollar's control no longer looked eternal. Keeping the petrodollar alive now meant fighting against the tide of history itself, the cracks in the system today. For half a century, the petrodollar ruled without question, but today the world it built is beginning to shift beneath it. The first cracks appeared quietly. Nations started to wonder, why trade oil in dollars at all? In recent years, countries like China, Russia, and India have begun buying and selling energy in their own currencies. Deals once settled exclusively in US dollars are now being paid in yuan, rubles, and rupees. Even US allies are testing alternatives. The rise of BRICS nations, representing more than 40% of the world's population, has turned de-dollarization from theory into strategy. Meanwhile, new technologies have changed everything. Digital currencies, blockchain settlements, and instant global transfers mean nations no longer need the U.S. banking system to trade. For the first time since 1974, oil can flow freely without touching the dollar. But this transition is not without chaos. The global economy was built on a single backbone, the dollar's trust. Remove that, and no one knows what replaces it. Will the world move toward multiple competing currencies? A Chinese-led petro-yuan, or a digital global token controlled by central banks? Noon can say for sure. But one truth is certain: the dollar's dominance is no longer guaranteed, and the system it built is slowly unraveling. The same invisible loop that once kept America rich is now being rewritten, one oil deal at a time. When the oil stops flowing, every empire believes its power will last forever. The Romans thought gold made them eternal. The British thought trade made them invincible. And America believed the dollar and oil would never lose their grip on the world. But history doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in circles. The petrodollar once defined an age of dominance, a system where control was printed, not earned, where wars were fought not for land, but for currency. And yet, the same force that built the modern world may now be quietly undoing it. The world no longer runs on energy alone. It runs on trust. If nations begin to believe that trust no longer belongs to the dollar, then the empire built on paper and oil will start to fade. Not with a crash, but with a whisper. When the oil stops flowing in dollars, it won't just mark the end of a currency system. It will mark the end of an era. The petrodollar was America's secret weapon. But like all weapons of power, it can never be used forever without consequence. The story of money has always been the story of power, and power eventually runs dry.